Okay, so in this video we are going to look at foreign policy. We've been talking about that, and we're going to kind of look at the long view of foreign policy, at least within the early republic. We're not going to focus on just Washington or Adams, but we're going to go really from Washington to Monroe and hit some of the major points. We're not hitting every different event that happened in foreign policy, but we are going to hit some of the major points and hit the major theme of America's foreign policy in the early republic days. And Washington has to deal with foreign policy pretty consistently during his presidency. Britain and France are at war, and he wants to remain neutral. And that's America's foreign policy. That's the primary foreign policy in the early republic, is neutrality. And Washington's farewell address is kind of the best way, the best summary of that policy. Now, his farewell address is not just about foreign policy and neutrality, but that is one of the most important parts of it. He encourages the young nation to avoid long-term untangling alliances, is kind of the phrase that he uses. And in other words, working together with another person, with another country is fine, but making it a long-term alliance that will drag you into their wars is a bad idea. Especially France and Britain is who he's really talking about and thinking about here. They are at war consistently over the decades, over the years. They are consistently at war with one another. If we become too tightly allied with one, every time that nation goes to war with the other, well then would be an expectation that we would side with them, and that would cause us problems. This is the most likely to be the problem with France, because France has already come to our aid in the American Revolution. And so that's really what he's talking about here. And that's kind of one of the main things of what he's talking about. But his overall message here is that, hey, remember, other countries, be it France, be it Great Britain, be it any other European nation or any nation at all, they are looking out for themselves. And they may try to influence our nation in their own best interest, not our best interest, which is what nations do. What happens is you're looking out for your own country. And so they may try to convince you, help us. But he says, don't do it. Don't let your sympathy for one country or your hatred for another influence you and do what is best for our country. So Washington is... We often think of Washington, and it is often said that Washington was not political, not part of a political party. Well, he certainly was political, but he wasn't associated with a political party. And he didn't openly associate with a political party, but the facts are most of his policy decisions kind of sided with the Federalist and the Federalist Party. So while he was not technically a Federalist, he, in many ways, his closest advisor, Alexander Hamilton, was a Federalist, and many of his policies support the Federalist perspective. And so if we think about this farewell address within that context, we start to see some things. So when he says, don't let your sympathy for one country, who would we likely have sympathy for? Well, in the war against Great Britain in the American Revolution, who helped us? France. France helped. Well, you're likely to have sympathy for France. And not only that, France is in the middle of a revolution where they're trying to throw off their own king and the oppressions and the tyranny of their king. Well, and it's kind of in response to and inspired in many ways by our revolution. And so many people all across the United States have great sympathy for the French and the French Revolution. And then seeing them at war with Great Britain during this time, there's a lot of people that want to go to war with Great Britain on the side of France. And then the second part of that phrase, or your hatred for another, influence you. So don't let your sympathy for one country, France, or your hatred for another influence you. Well, who might we hate? We would likely hate Great Britain at this time. So Great Britain, not that far removed from our own revolution, has been our enemy. And so what he's saying here is, don't let your sympathy for France, don't let your disdain or your hate for Great Britain convince you to go to war when it's not in our interest. when sure, it might help France, but it doesn't help us. It doesn't serve any purpose for us. And so this is really the Federalist perspective, and that's what he's supporting here. Now, it doesn't mean it's not wise counsel to avoid getting into wars that don't directly involve you or aren't in your best interest. That may be wise counsel. It certainly seems to be, but it is also in this case the Federalist kind of idea, because the particular countries that we would be most closely entangled with are France and Great Britain. So, in summary, Washington's farewell address, what is he saying? He's saying we need to be neutral, we don't need to be too closely allied with any country, and we need to only get involved when it is in our best interest to get involved. That's the message of the farewell address. John Adams continues that policy of neutrality, so much so that it actually probably costs him the election. There was such a clamor for war during part of his presidency that had he done that and been and gone to war, he very likely would have won the election of 1800, but he doesn't. He does what he thinks is the right thing to do, which is to continue neutrality. So we've talked about XYZ affair in class already, but just to recap, to make sure you remember, the French, after the British had been capturing our ships during Washington's presidency, and we set up Jay's Treaty, and that kind of helps a little bit, although Jay's Treaty isn't specifically really about that. It doesn't specifically address that. And now France is upset with us because we just made a treaty with Great Britain. And so they begin taking our ships that are headed to Great Britain, that we're trading with Great Britain. And so Adams sends an envoy to negotiate, and convince the French to stop this. And so our envoy meets with French representatives sent by the foreign minister Talleyrand, and these representatives to history have been known as X, Y, and Z. And before they say, before we'll really even discuss these issues with you, you need to give us $250,000 and promise to make our nation a $10 million loan. And then we'll talk. Then we'll discuss the issues at hand. Well, this is obviously not acceptable. So America responds, millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. In other words, instead of paying you money, we'll put all our money on building up our own defenses and not give you anything. And so the United States begins building up the United States Navy. And this is a very important part, because what's happening here is countries are not respecting the United States. And so he builds up the Navy, and he says, okay, let's try this again. Let's go again to France and see if they'll listen to us. And once he tries diplomacy again, and things work out this time with France. And so he avoids war with France. And he says that was really his greatest accomplishment during this time. So he's able to remain neutral and avoid war, and it is a continuation of Washington's policy. So with the election of 1800 and Thomas Jefferson, we have a change of party. So the Federalists were in power, and now we go to the Republicans being in power. But in one area, they both tend to agree that we should remain neutral. So he continues to try to avoid war, but it becomes increasingly difficult. Now, Great Britain is at it again, and they basically declare commercial war on the United States. They're attacking our shipping that goes anywhere other than Great Britain. They begin impressing our soldiers, or not our soldiers, our sailors. We discussed that in class as well. And so Jefferson decides we're going to cease all trade. And he does this because he's trying to send a message to both France and Great Britain: we're not going to do anything to you. He's hoping this will hurt their economy so much that they will All right, pardon me for a second. So that what he's trying to do is called the Embargo Act of 1807, the ceasing all trade. And as it says, it's an economic disaster. The idea is, well, it'll hurt their economies, Britain and France's economy, so much that they will then stop doing what they've been doing to us. Well, they're going to stop because we're not sending ships out anymore. So they won't be able to attack our shipping anymore. But the problem is, it hurts their economy. That's true, but it hurts America's economy even worse. And the nation is in an uproar, especially areas like New England that are primarily Federalist anyway. It's really destroying their economy in a major way. And the country is very upset, very divided. And Jefferson realizes this is such an economic disaster. He says, okay, how about we do this? Instead of ending trade with everybody, which is what the Embargo Act does, it says we're just in trade with Britain and France. The problem is that's an unenforceable plan. You cannot enforce that because once that ship leaves the port, so before you don't have any ships leaving the ports. No trade ships are leaving. Well, now they are leaving. And they're going out to sea. They're not just going along the coast or anything like that. And now it's much more difficult. They say they're headed for, Portugal or Spain, but really they go to France or they go to somewhere else. And you can't. It's an unenforceable problem. And so that's why he didn't try that to begin with. So the Embargo Act is over, and it's a disaster. So the Embargo Act is actually a step more than just neutrality. It is kind of our first attempt at isolationism and an isolationist philosophy of foreign policy. And this is going to be something that happens more in future generations, but we see here with the Embargo Act one little jump into isolationist policy for a short while. It doesn't work very well, but it is what happens. Then after Jefferson, we have Madison is elected, and Madison also tries to avoid war and avoid these things, but is unsuccessful. Eventually, America does go to war with Great Britain over the taking of our commercial vessels and impressing our sailors and all these other issues that have been going on. And the War of 1812, in many ways, is a big disaster for us. Washington is burned and all these other problems, but ends up really changing a lot of things in the United States. So we try neutrality, but eventually with the War of 1812, we can no longer remain neutral. We must declare war and go to war. At least that's the feeling that what Madison believed at the time. It was the only solution to the problem that we've been having. And then that brings us to James Monroe. Monroe is president after Madison, and you'll see it says isolationist or interventionist. So isolation, you completely cut yourself off from everybody. Interventionist, do you go out there and do you get involved in world's affairs? Well, the Monroe Doctrine, which is actually, it's called the Monroe Doctrine, but it was actually written by James Monroe's Secretary of State, which is pretty common. It would that your chief diplomat would write foreign policy. And so John Quincy Adams writes it. And the basic message is, we do not desire to get involved in European affairs, and Europe should no longer be involved in North and South America's affairs. So it sounds in some way isolationist, but it's not. It's actually asserting a certain amount of power in the Western Hemisphere, saying, hey, we are involved in the Western Hemisphere. North and South America is our affairs. Things that go on here is what we're involved in, so you don't get involved. This shows America's growth as a nation as they are moving toward and becoming a world power. Now, they're not a world power yet, but they're moving in that direction. It's 40 years since the revolution is over, and the United States is starting to assert their power, starting to assert their influence, and basically that's what this is. Now, it doesn't hurt that we have the backing of Great Britain, that does have the most powerful navy in the world. Why now, though, is the question. Well, Latin American countries have gained independence from their European colonizers, and the United States does not wants to let Europe know, hey, don't try to regain your lost colonies. You've lost colonies. They're not yours anymore. Don't come back and try to recolonize them or take them over. If you do that, we'll see that as an act of war. we don't want you here. Many of these former colonies were weak, and so America is asserting, no, they're not up here for you. They've gained their independence, and they are independent, and that's the end